Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my talk on the future of personal mobility. What I want to discuss with you here this afternoon in the next 30 minutes, it's basically why, when, and how the automobile is becoming autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. And already here on the title slide, you see a picture that's very dear to my heart. Because that picture is as old as I am. I won't tell you how old I am, but you can tell that the picture is not just 10 or 20 years old. The artist renderings have changed over time. But this was the vision of the year 2000. In the year 2000, we would have autonomous vehicles where you can sit in the car, you can turn to one another and enjoy a drink, as opposed to drive the car. And here we are in 2017, and we are still talking about the same thing. But there's a difference. We are much closer. So let's take a look how close we are. Well, I wanted to start with this, because I'm a mechanical engineer, and coming to an auto show, I thought I would talk about those parts here in orange that is really my passion, the chassis of the automobile. But if I was to talk about a multi-link suspension, a vacuum brake booster, and a rack and pinion steering, I doubt that we would have this room full as it is this afternoon, which makes me deeply humble and talk about something else, which is this. What mobility is actually becoming, and you see in the title that I say the future of the automobile is much more than just a box on wheels. We will see if it's actually just a computer on wheels. Actually, it's more complex than that. So the question actually is, if the automobile has become a mechanical dinosaur, and the smartphone is actually the ultimate mobility device, and if this is an either or if there's maybe much more in between. And what we have in between are those apps that vary from region to region, and the legality of some of these apps vary from region to region. But essentially, there's now quite a connection between the smartphone and the automobile. And this is what I mean by mobility. How do we actually consume the automobile? How do we get from places, maybe without owning mobility as we know it? So the question in the end becomes, if the car itself does not matter anymore, but what matters actually is just the access to mobility. So let's take a closer look. Let's take a closer look to what we read a lot about in the media and what forms the public opinion. And I want to share a few facts with you where we see that this is not actually the same thing. So we read about the companies, the tech companies about to shake up the auto industry. We read that young drivers don't want the ownership hassle anymore. They don't want to drive anymore. They don't get driver's license anymore. We read something that the automotive industry's golden era of profits is over. We read that technology disruptors threaten the auto industries, even at their home turf. This was for the Detroit Auto Show. And maybe you read something very, very similar here for the Seoul Motor Show, where it's all about tech and not so much about car. And you might read something that self-driving cars will just simply kill the automotive industry. Well, that's an opinion. Here are the facts. Actually, between now and 2030, there will be an additional 3.2 trillion US dollars in additional revenue on top of what this industry is today. Doesn't sound like decline to me. Right now, the overall automotive industry is about $4 trillion. So it almost doubles in 15 years' time, which is largely driven by this. Between 2015 and 2030, in just 15 years, there will be 23 million more vehicles sold per year than it was in 2015. And all this includes car sharing, ride sharing, changing demographics, and the likes. So there will be more cars, and we will see in a minute that this also comes with challenges. But I also want to highlight this, and forgive me that these are largely US numbers, because this is where I do most of my research these days. PMT, that's the acronym for passenger miles traveled. So that's actually all the miles that are accumulated in an economy or society divided by the numbers of travelers, and it increases again. We saw during the recession 2008 till 2010 that it was on decline. There are a number of reasons for this, but now we see that they go slightly up again. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this like, yes, it's business as usual, full steam ahead. No, we actually need to see what all this means. And this is why I came here today to discuss this with you a little bit deeper than just what we find in the media and just what the sheer facts might say. I just said a minute ago, more cars also means more challenges. Let's put this in perspective with the global trends that we see. Environmental challenges, urbanization, population growth, shifting global economies, changing demographics, which is really an issue in many societies, like my home country, Germany, like the country I live in the United States, and certainly neighboring country here in China, in Japan, and in other places as well. Consumer preferences, or I should say changing consumer preferences, where something like this might have an influence on a stock price much, much more than personal statements used to be in the past. And certainly there's emerging technologies where all of a sudden we see so much more of technology that goes in the car than when I got in this industry as a mechanical engineer, could possibly imagine. Now, what are the challenges that we get from this? On a global scale, we have about 1.2 million people killed in traffic accidents every year. 1.2 million people. That's about a Boeing 737 crashing every day and no one survives. We have people stuck in traffic. When I came here this morning, my driver advised me, let's get there on time because traffic is unpredictable. The numbers in the United States are that every commuter loses about 36 hours a year in traffic. The commute as such is much longer, but they lose this time. That's an entire work week. As a German, I like to say, well, there would be an additional week of vacation. As an American, I'm saying there would be an additional work week. So whatever your preference, you get the point. And then from emissions, air quality. It's estimated in the United States alone about $70 billion in healthcare costs just because of bad air from automobiles, which typically comes these days from petroleum. 30% of all petroleum production on the planet is being used in motor vehicles. And also one point that I maybe want to spend an extra 15 seconds to explain what I mean by dependency. Many of our societies, a lot of our cities are made for the car, which is much more in this country I live in, United States, maybe than the country I'm from, Germany. But we see that so much is just something where you depend on a car. How do you get there? Well, you have to drive. How do you get there? Well, you might need to get a taxi or ride-hailing. But so much, actually, that we forget that not everyone can drive for a number of reasons. It might be age, it might be health, it might be other circumstances. So we forget that about 30% of the population in the United States depends on others to get to a location. So what can we do? And there are 4 trends that clearly help us with overcoming those challenges. There's automation. Some call it autonomous driving. The technical term, the more research term, is actually automation, which basically means the driving task is taken over in part or completely by the computer, and the driver becomes first an observer and ultimately a passenger. There's communication, which is about vehicle-to-vehicle connectivity, but also vehicle-to-infrastructure, basically making the car as smart as the smartphone, if you will. So where we really see the vehicle exchange the data with a central infrastructure or with one another. And of course, there's electrification, that the fossil fuel-based powertrain that we've had for over 125 years now is now replaced with electric components. Note the difference. I'm not saying an electric car. I'm talking about electrification, which is everything from mild hybrids, full hybrids, plug-in hybrids, battery electric vehicles, and ultimately fuel cell technology. And there's commoditization, where there are also different names for this. Some call it shared mobility, others call it diverse mobility, others call it intermodal mobility. I call it commoditization because it's basically just looking at mobility in terms of how do we consume it, which summarizes car and ride sharing and other modes as well. But largely we've seen many changes and new concepts in car and ride sharing, which addresses the point that I made on the first slide, that car ownership might be on its way out. Now, the interesting part in all of this is that we should not look at any one of these four trends in a vacuum. We actually need to take them together because they are connections. For instance, an automated car can drive to a charging station and charge itself, especially if it's together with the car sharing and ride sharing, so that you don't really need to have someone else charging this car. Or something, vehicle reservation for car sharing and ride sharing would be impossible today without the connectivity that those cars have, which does not have to be a super sophisticated connectivity, but basically you need to know there's a car, there's a connection, there's a consumer, and all of a sudden you disrupt mobility. At least this is what those solutions claim. There's a connection between automation and connectivity that I'm a very huge proponent of. I say those who say autonomous have to say connected as well, because otherwise it won't work. There's a connection between communication and electrification in order to find the charging station, to do the billing, to actually make the reservation for charging. And there's a connection between commoditization and electrification, because with electric vehicles you drop the cost of ownership, the operating cost of vehicles, so therefore that you can offer more affordable mobility to people. And just to give you one more example, the connection that we see between automation and commoditization, once we really have driverless vehicles, it will change completely the equation for the shared vehicle, because you don't need drivers anymore. They drive themselves, they come to your location. So the important piece really is those four trends build on one another, they actually accelerate one another. And what this leads to is not just changing mobility behavior, it's not just changed vehicles or changing vehicles, it's really changing the industry, changing the competition all over. So what do we see with all of this? For one, that actually everyone agrees. I hope that so far I have not told you anything new. I would expect that all of you know about autonomous, connected, electric, and shared. So therefore, it's no surprise. Even the smartest in our industry, not me, would say soon we will be able not to make money anymore with cars that don't integrate with customer smartphones. And you find others that say that the smartphone is more important actually than the car, but even the inventor of the automobile, from my home country, they say if it doesn't connect to the phone, you cannot sell it. Mary Barra, very often quoted, saying, we are going to see more change in the next 5 to 10 years than we've seen in the last 50 years. Mary Barra, CEO of General Motors, an alumna of the university where I teach at Stanford, where we brag ourselves that we have very smart students there, and it's great to see students here in the audience as well. I'm looking forward to discussions later on. Toyota, largest car company, where we see, well, we have to embrace this change because we cannot really generate the solutions within our conventional business. So we need to go beyond. It's not just about selling cars. And I think that's a very important statement because in the automotive industry, it used to be something, you sell a car and you call it success, and you basically wait 3 to 5 years until the customer comes again. Now this will be different. Once you sell the car, the journey and the relationship with the customer begins, because how do you actually stay connected with the customer over time? How do you entice the customer over and over again so that the customer actually has a relationship with you over time? Which very much talks to how consumer electronics companies actually stay connected with their consumers. But now they want to get into this field as well. Tim Cook, CEO of Apple, said software becomes an increasingly important part of the car of the future. And actually the industry is in an inflection point of massive change. No one really knows what that means, but we are very, very curious to see. Uber, true disruptor of mobility for sure. Travis Kalanick says, well, we're working on this because 1 million fewer people are going to die every year. Traffic in all cities will be gone, and significantly reduced pollution and trillions of hours will be given back to people. Clearly a visionary statement. Let's see how close we can get. And I really like this Elon Musk quote. And for a number of reasons I chose this. For one, we need to have Elon Musk on here. But also, he really makes a point. And what I will say, I don't agree with every statement that Elon Musk says. I really agree with this one. People don't understand how hard it is to manufacture something. Or he actually said it's one thing to build one car, but it's incredibly harder to build many vehicles until you really get those products here to the show floor at the Seoul Motor Show. It's very different from a nice pilot project or prototype. Now, while everyone agrees that change is coming, in my primary job as a consultant, I get always 4 questions regarding those trends. For one, when will autonomous vehicles come to the market? Number 2, what is the business case for the connected vehicle? Number 3, what is the inflection point for electric vehicles? And number 4, will consumers only share but not own vehicles? Those questions come up over and over again. The interesting part is, you don't just get these questions from car companies, not just from suppliers. You get them also from multi-business conglomerates who now wonder, this mobility thing, is that something that we should do? Might be the next horizon. We are not involved in this. Maybe we should. So this is where we see it's much more than just a box on wheels. So I want to take some time and answer each of these questions. I hope that I will give you some food for thought and that I don't disappoint you too much if I don't have the ultimate answer to all of this. Number 1, what are the forecasts? And we actually see 2 things. For one, that forecasting the deployment of autonomous vehicles is incredibly different, if not impossible. They don't really agree. But it's also very popular because this question pops up over and over again. And you see there over time the percentage of new vehicles sold on a global level typically. And you see, consulting firm I also work for, McKinsey, where we said in 2030 about 15% of all new vehicles will be autonomous. IHS and BCG, a little bit more conservative there. Navigant, more progressive. But it's also interesting, the orange line was created 2 to 3 years before the other one. It might be very interesting to revisit those charts in 2 to 3 years. If we're just moving them across, or if we're actually getting into those curves. Because for one, we see we're just at the beginning of a 20-plus year journey towards fully self-driving cars. We also see all these tech companies getting into the space. And while some say they have a lead and the traditional automotive industry is losing it, we actually see that the incumbents, the traditional car companies, are catching up. Catching up when it's about artificial intelligence, catching up when it's about testing and how you get all this experience on the road, and also catching up how consumers actually interact with novel technologies. I'm by no means suggesting that the car companies would not know this, but things are happening at such a rapid pace that it really needs those tech companies to actually remind the car companies every once in a while. Things are changing. Don't just talk about it, do it. And also, we still need to see if the solution for the autonomous car actually is artificial intelligence and deep learning algorithms, or how we actually need to fuse this with more traditional approach in the world. So there we see there's already a lot of things that need to happen in order to get actually on those curves here towards a higher market penetration with automated vehicles. Number two, we did ask the question, what is the business case for a connected car? What we see in those two graphs here on the very left, we asked the question, would you actually switch your current car brand if therefore you would get a better connected vehicle? And we actually see for one that this number is increasing, and that now actually, or in 2015, we are just getting the 2016 numbers ready. About 40% would actually say, if that car can connect better to my smartphone than the one I have, I'm willing to switch the brand. And that's actually very big. Automotive customers are very loyal customers. But if they say, no, it's more important to me that it connects to my phone than actually I'm driving a certain brand, I think that's a very important story. You then see on the right, are people willing to pay for it? Yes, they are, but not to the same extent at which they actually prefer to have the best connectivity available. And this is really what we need to see, that it becomes a minimum requirement that the car connects to your phone and to the world. It's not that you should expect huge revenues in this, but if your car doesn't connect, it's not being acknowledged, it's not being considered by the consumer. We also need to see, are people willing to share their data? And this is where we actually realize over and over in surveys, if they see a benefit in it, people are willing to share data. So to just ask for location and driving data would not work. But if you say, I give you free parking, I give you access to the faster route, then people are willing to share data. And then there's always the question about the killer app. What is the killer app for the autonomous car? We did workshops at Stanford University already in 2009 and before. We brought many industry people, insurance companies, researchers together. We were looking for the killer app and we concluded we don't know which one it is. And if it were that easy, it wouldn't be a killer app. But maybe it's actually that shared mobility is the killer app for connectivity. Autonomous driving, as I said earlier, really requires connectivity, so they are the killer apps. On electrification, what is the inflection point for the electric vehicle? And very often we hear something that $150 per kilowatt hour, this is when finally the equation is solved and that people will buy these battery electric vehicles. $150 per kilowatt hour. Well, if you look a little bit deeper, you actually realize it's not an equation that you can just solve like a mechanical engineer and then say, there's a solution. There's actually much more. There's much more in terms of consumer preferences. Convenience plays a big role. Even if it's cheaper, if it's less convenient, people don't do it. I would think that many of you would agree with me if I say the automobile is not a rational purchase decision. If you go out to the show floor and look at those vehicles, ask yourself, is that rational? No, but it's cool. I want it. So once we reach the $150 per kilowatt hour, which will be within the next 1 or 2 years, possibly, we still need to work harder. Regulation will play a very important role. How you actually not just incentivize the purchase, but also the usage of those vehicles. And there again, it's a lot about parking and getting access to preferred lanes that actually make people switch, which we see in Silicon Valley all the time, that people very often get electrified vehicle to get on the high occupancy lane. On the fuel cell, and I thought that the audience here is very much interested in that. Fuel cell is fantastic technology, and it might be the ultimate solution, but really electrification till we get there will take a long time, especially because of the infrastructure that we need for fuel cell. Where do we get the hydrogen from? How do we get it to the vehicle? These are the two big questions there. On shared mobility, will consumers only share and not own their vehicles? Here's some data from New York City from December 2014 till basically March of this year. And you see taxi, Uber, and Lyft. Uber and Lyft, probably many, if not all of you know, are the leading ride-sharing companies. So basically a taxi service that's enabled through a very well-made app. And you see taxi in slight decline, and Uber shooting up there, and Lyft still a very solid margin at the bottom. So what does that mean? What's the context? How should we interpret this? Well, certainly ride-sharing is increasing, but that does not mean that people don't want to own a vehicle anymore. Very often it's complementary. That's what we need to understand. And also, the interesting point will be once ride-sharing gets to the suburbs, because now we have this mostly in the inner cities, where the traffic is already bad, and actually much of the traffic happens outside the cities because you have longer distances. So therefore, the suburbs will be key in all of this. And again, many of the members to car sharing or users of ride sharing still have their own vehicle. So that's something to take into account when it's about car sales, which we looked at in the beginning. And yes, younger people get their driver's license later, 1 to maybe 3 years later average. We see this a lot in the United States, also in Europe. But they still get a driver's license because very often it's for economic reason. And I applaud those who really spend their money on education much more than on just getting a fancy ride. And still, in the end, they need mobility and they need a car that they own. So therefore, these are not black or white decisions. Summing it up, so what is really the timeline in all of this? I thought that I would need to leave you with a timeline in all of this. And why I'm going to animate those 4 trends: automation, connectivity, electrification, and commoditization. What's in the orange? What is the future vision where we don't really know when it's going to happen? In automation, we currently see a lot of autonomous vehicle demos and pilots. This will continue. Then there's AMOD, which is automated mobility on demand, which is basically a fully self-driving little taxi mobility pod that you can call with your smartphone and gets you to your location, but only within certain boundaries in the city. And then there's actually a lot happening in trucks, which we will see probably in the second part of the next decade. But the personal autonomous vehicle, where I'm now here at Kintex, just push a button and it takes me to Busan. This is the vision. And at some point we will have this here on the show floor. But I don't think that we will have it within the next 15 years, that I can do this magic push of the button and get to Busan without any interaction necessary. Communication, connected infotainment, we have already a lot. There's more now happening, that we will see more software over-the-air updates in the vehicles. What is really interesting, when will we have the vehicle to infrastructure via a Wi-Fi standard, which is what many countries are working on. And that is unclear when we will get there. Probably starting in the beginning of the next decade, but this is a pretty long journey to get there. On electrification, we obviously have already many battery electric vehicles. We have a few fuel cell vehicles, which I think are very exciting as first pilot programs. We now get more and more plug-in hybrids and battery electric vehicles. I think the majority of vehicles electrified, and this is why I say it's very important to note electrified, not just battery electric. This will still be 10 years out that it might be the majority. Fuel cell becoming mainstream, I think it's a fantastic vision. On commoditization, where we basically see car and ride-sharing already happening today, becoming profitable, that is quite a challenge. This is not something that we have today, but they have to become profitable over the next 3 years. Otherwise, it will not be a sustainable business long term. And then this trend, car sharing merges into ride sharing. This comes together with autonomous vehicles. This is the connection that we see between those trends, which we saw on the circular diagram. But that the ownership is obsolete, that is a vision. I'm not quite sure what timestamp I should put on it. What does it mean to the industry? Real quickly, in the interest of time, on the very left, you actually see those numbers that are shared at the very beginning, where you see the revenues from the automotive industry, which is to the dark blue part, traditional automotive sales. The lighter blue part is after sales and services, and then on top, the gray is recurring services, basically mobility services and a little bit of connectivity. This is where we see the additional $3.2 trillion that I said in the beginning, where you get this on top. Just to finalize, what does it mean to the industry as such? If you look across the value chain from R&D, manufacturing, distribution of the vehicles, sales, aftermarket and services, and finally then the recurring revenues in terms of mobility services and the likes. It's something that the OEM, the vehicle manufacturers, basically all do by themselves today. They have not quite figured out the recurring services model. They're working on it, but other than that, it's a car company that designs the car, makes the car, distributes the car, sells the car, services the car. And there are suppliers that help with this, but only in very limited segments of the value chain. In the future, we probably see more dilution, especially in the distribution and sales, because there's a lot of disruption happening in that field already. And the suppliers actually might extend their range. There's a lot of talk about tier 0.5 suppliers. So where automotive suppliers might become vehicle manufacturers and might be a so-called deliverer of white goods or contract manufacturing. There are new OEMs. We see a lot of those startups, many of them heavily funded out of China, that become very similar maybe to the traditional OEMs, but might not care that much about after sales and service, because they say to get out a dealership network is very, very intensive with capital. So let's see if we can make this more efficient. The tech players of the world. We could put many logos behind this, but if I say tech or IT or smartphone companies, you know which ones I mean. R&D for sure. The manufacturing of the car, probably not. This is where the contract manufacturing comes in again. But then the customer interaction, after-sales services, and the recurring revenues in terms of mobility services and also software updates. This is where you meet the customer. This is a stronghold of the tech players. The mobility providers, such as ride-sharing, car-sharing companies, might get involved actually in the R&D of the vehicle. And then certainly when it comes to the sales of the car, when it comes to the maintenance and operation of the vehicles, and obviously it's a recurring services as such, how do you actually get those vehicles to the consumer and turn it into revenue? So I hope this is some food for thought for you. And really think about it. The picture I showed you in the beginning, which now I give it away, was from 1969, has not really worked out until the year 2000, but we are getting much, much closer to this ultimate vision of autonomous, connected, electrified, and shared mobility. With this, thank you very much for your attention and enjoy the rest of the day here at the show. Thank you.
네, 여러분 다시 한번 큰 박수 부탁드리겠습니다. Thank you very much for your outstanding keynote speech.